Today's presentation is called Historical Research, Sources, Successes, and Snags. Chris Enss is a New York Times bestselling author who's been writing about women of the Old West for more than 30 years. She has penned more than 50 books on the subject, and her work has been honored with 9 Will Rogers Medallion Awards, 3 Western Writers of America Spur Finalist Awards, and many more. Enss's most recent works are The Widowed Ones, Along Came a Cowgirl, and An Open Secret, a story of Deadwood's most notorious bordellos.
That's right.
Candy Moulton has authored 17 Western history books, co-edited a collection of short fiction and a two-volume encyclopedia, and written and produced several documentary films. She won Spur Awards from Western Writers of America for her biography, Chief Joseph, and for her documentary films In Pursuit of a Dream and The Battle of Red Buttes. Moulton served as editor of WWA's Roundup magazine for 17 years and the WWA executive director for 11 years. Peter Oltchick got his start in writing as sports editor for the oldest college weekly in America, the Colgate Maroon. He has written for Sweet 101 an online magazine and is the author of a children's picture book, Clean Clara. He lives in New York City with his wife Amanda and 2 children, Zoe and Andrew. Oltchick's most recent book, Football for Fun, is co-written with his father-in-law, Bill Bell. Chuck Raasch is a native, is a native South Dakotan journalist and author. His first book, Imperfect Union, was published in 2016. His new nonfiction, Life Painted Red, is set in Dakota territory. Raasch was a national correspondent for U.S. Today, Gannett, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and has had bylines from 49 states and 5 continents. He is a graduate of South Dakota State University's Journalism Department and was a Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. Raasch lives in Alexandria, Virginia. You guys can take it away.
Good afternoon. I see we're not quite as popular as the Bison crowd, but that'll keep the temperature in the room down. And I wanted to expand on one thing in the, pardon?
I'm a jackrabbit.
You're a jackrabbit? Okay, good. All right, good. There's a lot of us, so yeah. I wanted to expand on something from the introductions, and that was the reference to WWA. That's not World Wrestling Association. That's Western Writers of America. Yes, exactly. So just to clarify that from the beginning. So we're just going to launch right into it here, the title of our conversation today is Sources, Successes, and Snags, which is some fairly sneaky alliteration right there, and then we can probably repeat that as we go along here. But I want to start with, let's start with Chris Enss, who's actually written 54 books, which is mind-boggling to me. I can't imagine a career that's been that prolific and successful. And Chris, why don't you just talk about sort of from the 36,000 feet view of some things that you can, some pointers and maybe some snags that you've hit, and let's get the conversation launched that way. So.
Well, I think I could probably talk about snags that I've hit. Oftentimes, I'll just go from that. Oftentimes you find people think that they own particular pieces of history. And they're in archive departments that think that they own that history, and they're not willing to really share. Most recently I'm working on, I won't go into details, but I am working on a story about, a book about a particular cowgirl, very famous cowgirl, and I contacted the archives to get the information about her, and I was told we have no personal material about her, which I thought was very strange. But then a couple of weeks went by and I saw this same woman doing a presentation for the Cody Museum, giving a PowerPoint with those personal items in her PowerPoint. So I phoned, and then she let me know that she's doing her dissertation on that subject.
Oh.
So that's a snag.
Yeah.
That's a major snag right there. So you have to find your way around that particular area if you want to continue on with that story. But I'm a licensed private investigator, so I love to go and try to do the deep dive on something. And I always like to find primary source material as much as I can. I've even purchased things after watching Antiques Roadshow. Because a lot of history is in private hands, and people are told what that's worth, and sometimes it's not worth a lot, but they want to sell it. So
Yeah.
anyway,
That's an interesting story on that particular archivist. That would border on unethical, I would assume. Is there any? What did you do? What did you do in the next step? Did she share with you, or?
no
She didn't.
intention of sharing with me. Just like, what can you do? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not criminal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's immoral, it's unethical. But
Unethical,
who are you
yeah.
going to call? You
Yeah,
know,
that's
so.
true. So that is a snag. So yeah. So, Candy, any initial thoughts?
I can lead right into Chris's snag. I've hit the same exact snag when I was working on my Valentine McGillicuddy book, and I went to the names are not going to be shared here because it's in the region. But I went to Fort Robinson because Valentine McGillicuddy was a post soldier or doctor there, and I ran into one of the most incredibly helpful archivists I've ever met, Tom Beaker. He was the superintendent at Fort Rob, and he took me in literally his office and shoved stuff off of his desk and said, "Here, work here, and I will bring you material." And like, it was just so much material, piles upon piles of material, and you're so grateful when you run into something like that. And then he's told me, "You need to go to South Dakota, and you need to go to institution not to be named and talk to them because they have a trunk of materials that you need to see." And one of the things in that trunk of materials was an original diary by Fanny McGillicuddy. And I got a car and I drove north into South Dakota and went to said institution, talked to said person, and was told that I couldn't see the trunk. Same exact thing.
Yeah.
I never got to see the trunk. It was someone who was working on something and didn't want to share the information, didn't want anybody else to see it. We don't own history.
Yeah.
We
Well,
don't.
that person
own-
thought they
They
owned
thought
history.
they did, but I was fortunate because I found through digging hard that there was actually the copy of Fanny McGillicuddy's diary that they had in the trunk was not the original, and the original indeed was in Provo at BYU and the Charles Red Center, and I was able to secure a grant to go to the Red Center and got to work with that original diary. So there are ways to work around it. Sometimes, it would have been a lot easier had I been able to see it the day that I was there. It took a lot more time. It took a lot more effort. It took a lot more money, which when you're doing the job, and I know Chris and I do a lot of the same kinds of things, particularly, money is always an issue because travel is not cheap, and so you have to figure out how you do it. And so the greatest thing that's happened, I think, for history writers, maybe any writer, but certainly for history writers, in my 40-year career of doing this stuff, is digitization.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can sit at home now and read.
Right.
I mean, with my McGillicuddy research, nothing was on the internet at that time. I made multiple trips to Kansas City to the National Archives, and how I paid for that is I got a little gig editing a newsletter for the Oregon California Trails Association. There was no pay involved with this gig, with the exception that they had board meetings twice a year in Independence, Missouri, and they would fly me back or pay for my gas to get to Independence, and I would every time add a week on because I had the transportation, and I'd stay in some fly-by-night cheap hotel and do my research for a week. And when you're doing work like that, it's like, I'm not a grad student, I'm not affiliated with a university in any way, I have no support other than my own pocketbook. And so when you go to the archives, you are there when they open in the morning, you take a granola bar, you put it in the bag somewhere, you take 10 minutes at lunch to eat your granola bar, go to the bathroom, and go back and work until they close and boot you out.
Yeah.
Because you only have so much time.
Yeah.
And those were the days when you couldn't even, early on, I didn't even have a laptop to take. But, so it was handwriting.
Handwriting, yeah.
I didn't have a phone. That's the greatest miracle of research.
Yes.
Your cell phone, because now you can just go and just snap pictures, snap, go home, put it all in folders, and
Yeah.
you've got it.
Exactly.
So.
Can I ask you, just before we get to
Yeah.
Peter, all three of you, how many institutions, when you go in for research, what percentage of them charge you for research?
Not for research.
I was charged for research for
wow.
this book.
Wow.
It was,
No.
it was a 0 for me.
0 for you too?
Yeah.
I was rather surprised. At an institution in state that's not to be named, but it was $30 to do research there during the pandemic, which I was the only person in the building.
Wow.
So anyway,
I think
Not run into
for
that.
me, I think it was only if it was really excessive printing, where they had to do
Right.
lots of copying
Right.
and
Right.
Well, I
normal
had to pay for
expenses.
copies.
But
this was $30 up front, and and at the end of it, I arranged for archive material to be deposited there, so I wasn't going to get refunded for that. So Peter, let's talk a little
yeah,
bit
so
about yours.
I'm going to go the other way if that's okay. I think I'm going to start with just an incredible success and go from there. So for me, a little bit of context, my late father-in-law had started this project and was able to go pretty far. It was a book about a team, and he had health issues and wasn't able to finish. And I kind of got into it 5 or 6 years later, and we never talked about the project. So, it was a very unique experience. When you talk about co-authors, usually you're doing something together. This was the opposite. Anyway, when I was getting into the project, I was trying to figure out, sort of from a biography perspective, the last 12 years of this subject's life. His name is Coach Stuart Ferguson, and by the way, the football field just down the road is named after him. So this is kind of incredible to be here, actually. So what I wanted to do was I really wanted to try to say, okay, how am I actually going to try to find out about his life in real detail in those years? Is there any way I can find people that can help? You really need champions, I find, in something like this. So literally with Googling, I came across, the first thing was a Deadwood High School blog that was run by a guy named Dick Dunwoody, class of '54, Deadwood High School. Searched through this blog, saw some pictures of the coach, saw his passion to try to keep the Deadwood High School experience alive. As some of you may know, Deadwood and Lead merged in 1971, and I will say
72.
71, the start of the school year was 71.
72.
Yeah, right,
It's
yeah.
considered.
Hey, I did the research.
Yeah,
too.
right.
But thank you for
lived it.
But as some of you may know, the whole Deadwood Lead sort of relationship was pretty sort of a bloodthirsty little brother, big brother sibling rivalry, but I won't go into all that now. But what I will say is that I wrote a personal letter to Dick Dunwoody. Truly a letter, giving a little bit of the background that I had done about this project, what I had seen from his blog, and just asked for help. Can we talk about this project that I'm really trying to make into this biography? Sent it in kind of like a manila letter, so like it looked sort of official, with my name and Ray, Coach Stuart Ferguson biography. He got back to me pretty quickly. We spoke on the phone. That was fairly surreal, I have to say. And then immediately after we spoke, he reached out to another classmate, one of his really good friends. He was class of '55. His name is Bill Bashara. If anyone's in Rapid City, he's got a 3-generation restaurant that's fantastic. Colonial, shout out to the Colonial. And Bill was the one that was able to actually introduce me to all of these ex-players with emails and who was feeling good or where people were at in their life, and made an entry for me to actually make a trip coming out here possible. So I was able to interview 7 or 8 sort of former players, in addition to, and this is again sort of the really good stuff that I think comes from some of these happy surprises, he put me in contact with the coach's daughter-in-law. The coach had a son who was named Stuart Jr. He became known as Freddie. Freddie married Jill, this woman Jill. They only married for 3 years. Freddie got sick, so they had a short marriage. But Jill kept in very close contact with the coach's wife. That wife was actually almost like a grandmother figure to her 2 kids from her second marriage. This doesn't happen.
Mhm.
So for me to be welcomed into that house and to spend 2 or 3 hours going through all of these sort of photo albums and things that Edna, the coach's wife, gave to Jill, entrusted her with all of her kind of memorabilia, that's when I saw the full biography come to life, and that's what really helped with all these other things that we can talk about, kind of, go from there.
So it all started with a personal letter, though. I mean,
To this
yeah.
person, yeah, he
Yeah.
had to respond
Yeah.
because, I did not have an in, per
Right.
se.
And you're
this
going
world.
to the authentic source at that point because this person lived it, right, basically, or knew people who lived
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
This is, and some of these people, which is just incredible, are actually, I think, going to be showing up in about 45 minutes. I think about 8 of the alumni are actually arriving today because Dick Dunwoody now is so excited about this book coming to life.
good for you.
He has reactivated his Facebook in ways that are not even, I don't know how he's doing all this. Maybe, but this has been,
So
this
if
has
the
been
big
my
bus-
last week. There's a lot happening.
If the big bus pulls up, that's your
Yeah,
fan
that's-
club. That's your fan
Go,
club.
go Bears, not Gold Diggers, go Bears. Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm impressed it's lead and not led for your pronouncement of.
It's Belfouche, I learned as
Yeah,
well. I got that one.
How
Come on.
about Pierre?
Pierre.
Okay, there
I'm
you
three
go.
for- I'm
there you
3
go.
for 3.
All right.
Come on.
You're 3 for 3.
Don't mess
Good,
with the New
good.
York.
Well, I think I'm going to talk a little bit that touches on what everybody has said to this point. And thinking about this, my book is set in Dakota Territory in the 1880s. It's a nonfiction book, and a lot of it has to do with the landscape and how the landscape looked and how this young woman from Washington D.C. came out here and fell in love with it and wrote so much about the rolling prairies, in particular west of the Missouri River. And so I was looking for a great quote from a great author that might talk about the appeal of the plains and the prairies, which are often, at that point they were called the Great American Desert, and often overlooked in the American letters and in all genres of literature. And so I ran across this great quote from the great Willa Cather. Okay, maybe some of you have heard it. Anyone can love the mountains. It takes a soul to love the prairie. Okay, except she never said it. So, which is my first, my point exactly, which is my first point of what I call the ABCDs of researching history, and that is to authenticate. And you have no excuse in this modern age of not trying to go as far down as what Chris talked about, drilling down deep into the origins of something. And there's something, I don't know if you've heard about it on the internet now, that's called confirmation bias, which leads to my second point, which is B, broaden when you go in to look at a topic. Don't hone in on the topic right away, broaden it. And I could give you an example from my book. There's a second main character in my book that I had no idea who she was. She was referred to in another book as an inconsequential, illiterate old woman who was the main protagonist in my book, companion for 1 year, when it turns out she was a widely known and widely loved and respected Dakota woman who started life in Minnesota, moved west when they were pushed west after the 1862 massacre and the 1868 treaties, and she actually is about a third of my book, and I never would have run across her had I not gone in with open eyes and really researched her. And frankly, there probably should be a book written about her because she was an amazing woman. Among other things, when she was 2 years old, she survived for 2 days under a kettle after her tribe had been attacked by a neighboring tribe, and her father was killed, and her mother ran off with her 2 other siblings and came back and got her 2 days later. And then her life was just one adventure after another with the Riggs family, the very, very important family, the missionary families here. The C in the ABCDs is crowdsource. And that's one great thing that the internet can do for you. And some of the citations in my second book came out of me crowdsourcing because I did not know a lot about the male in my book, the man who married this woman from Washington D.C. He was half white and half native, and I found online literally a Santee Sioux genealogy group that knew a lot about him. that's the only place that I could find this information on him. And some of the stuff that had been written about him just in a casual way got basics of his life wrong, like his nationality and that sort of thing. And this woman became a very big help in this thing. And then the third thing Candy mentioned is digitalization. I don't know if any of you know it, but the National Archives right now is starting to finish is in the end game of putting online searchable data and historic documents and other things like that, and half a billion documents are going to be available to the public on October 1st next year. And so in searchable ways. Now, you got to know how to search it. It's still kind of clunky when you go in on it, but to illustrate how that could work for somebody in a research project here, we're in the Cody room here. So I went on the archives and I searched for Cody, and I wanted to look for an interesting story about Bill Cody. And on there you can see 5 letters that he wrote to either the Secretary of the Interior in 1905, a man by the name of James Garfield, who was the son of the president who was assassinated, who was the Secretary of the Interior then, or to President Roosevelt himself, Teddy Roosevelt himself at the time. And what this gentleman was writing, what Bill Cody was writing, Wild Bill Cody was, or Buffalo Bill Cody was writing to him about was Buffalo Bill had established a town in Wyoming, and the town of Powell was coming in there, and he was trying to stop it. He didn't want Powell because it was going to compete with the town that Buffalo Bill had started, and he was trying to get Roosevelt to intervene. Well, long story short, Roosevelt didn't intervene. The town that Cody established there now has 293 people, and the town of Powell has 6,400. So we know who won that. So
That's not so.
Fact
check. That's not so.
What's not so?
I thought
Cody is bigger than Powell.
Well, that's what I meant. No, I'm talking. No, the town was not Cody. The town was another town called. No, it was called. Let me write it down here. I'd not heard of it before. Ralston.
Oh, Ralston, yeah.
Yeah, it's
That's tiny.
233 people. And
Yeah,
I didn't know
probably
until I literally did that this morning just to sort of show what you can get in these types of circumstances. But I can't stress enough that the internet has these confirmation biases, and you have to really, really be careful about going back to original sources on a lot of things. And once it's repeated in one book, then it'll be cited in the next book, and we've all run across that sort of problem. So, can anybody address sort of the issue of there's a lot going on now in the public sphere about what history we should tell. Has that impeded your work at all?
I try not to let it. I think you should be able to tell the story you want to tell, no matter how you tell it. And you can get shot at. Yep, I have a real strong flak jacket. I've been shot at a lot of times. Years ago.
Literally shot at?
Well, figuratively shot
right,
at. I've
right,
probably
okay.
been literally shot at
Right,
too.
right.
But you have to take shots. You have to be ready to do that. But no one owns this particular story. I don't believe that. If that were the case, a whole lot of stories would never be told.
Right.
Yeah.
A whole lot of stories.
I think too, I find a particular subject interesting, and some people get very upset about it. I was sharing with the folks
Right.
here before we began. The book that I'm here talking about is an open secret. I had to look at I don't remember what it is. But it's an open secret. It's the story of the notorious bordellos in Deadwood. And I really was fascinated with that subject. I've written a lot about prostitution of the American frontier. I did an event a couple of weeks ago in Montana and was introduced as the foremost historian or authority on prostitution, which I don't really know how to take that.
That's
but,
your brand.
But anyway, that's not true. But anyway.
And this is the source of that. So.
Yeah. But I thought it was interesting. I had a woman come up to me and was really very upset here that I had even written a book about the bordellos, because she said that is. That's almost like writing a book in praise of Jeffrey Epstein. And I said, it's not the same thing at all.
No.
But she was pretty adamant about the fact that this book and the fact that there is a brothel museum was only elevating sex trafficking. I disagree with that. I think that history needs to be told, even if sometimes it's not attractive. I think that it belongs to all of us, and I think we only learn from being able to tell all these stories and not omitting some things because it might be distasteful. And by that, I'm not championing prostitution, because that's how she took it. I'm not doing that, but yeah, I mean, I think you run a risk when you write something that everybody might not agree that needs to be written at all.
But isn't it a major history of the women of the West? I
It's-
mean, their
it's-
husbands died, their everything, all their support died. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
How
I
many
mean,
jobs
but
were
I,
open to them?
but I think people don't like to hear that part of it. I mean, I
Interesting.
think they have this idea in their mind that, and particularly with prostitution, that every woman that was involved in it absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
And when you say, oh, that's not necessarily true. I'm not saying everybody went into it going, I love this trade.
Right.
But there were some people like Pam Holiday, who was the last woman to turn off the lights and shut the door at a brothel. She enjoyed it and said that she wished that she'd started when she was 16. She would own all of Deadwood. See, that's a part of the history that people find distasteful, and they don't want to hear that, and they like it very much to be something that everybody hated that, but that's not the story you can tell all the time. So
That was Pam's Purple Door, right?
Yep.
it was Pam's Purple
Yeah,
Door,
yeah.
correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, just from my own kind of perspective from this project, was I thought it was really important. I think I used the words in the notes section to have a truthful portrait. So for me, that meant there were these unpublished memoirs, sort of circa 1947, that he wrote, sort of looking back at a time of his life when he became famous for different reasons. He played football for fun. He barnstormed around. They were known as the Marx Brothers of football. All this stuff, but he goes pretty deep in terms of some tough language and other things. And for me, and from Bill, my father-in-law at the time, I wanted to try to figure out what part of these unpublished memoirs, in terms of his internal life, in addition to sort of just following the facts and the newspapers and all that, how do you kind of marry those two so that we're actually telling a story where I feel as though we're trying to put ourselves in the way that he was living his life and how he thought about it and his struggles and things that you would not have seen or thought about if you don't actually bring some of this tougher language
Right.
into it. So I thought it was a challenge, like what to use, what not to use, and then also just to make sure, that we were acknowledging that, say, hey, that this, there might be some people uncomfortable, with certain sentences and things, but in terms of really trying to find the full perspective of a very unorthodox, complicated, fascinating person.
You can't tell an authentic story without telling it with some of that language. I would assume. When my editor suggested in the foreword of my book that there may be language in my book that would offend some people today. In particular, one of the things, frankly, what got me to write this book was in 1989 I was doing research on something totally different, and I was looking at old newspapers. Back when you had to go to microfilm and microfiche to do that, now you can go to newspapers.com, which is one of the greatest sites in the world.
The best.
What triggered it was there was a half-page ad in the St. Paul, Minnesota paper. It was the Globe, long ago, out of business, and thank God for it was such a racist, terrible publication, particularly toward Native Americans in the Dakota Territories. And anyway, what triggered it was there was a half-page ad in this newspaper that was headlines about this big that said, "She married a savage," and it was advertising what they called back then a dime museum, which was basically a freak show. There were, man wrestling a bear and the world's strongest woman and all that kind of stuff. And so this mixed race couple was joining to make ends meet and to save enough money to buy a farm. But we had a discussion about whether or not that word should be used. And I made the point of it has to be used to authenticate the depths of the racism and and other things that were going on the frontier at the time. You can't scrub that kind of stuff. And frankly, that's one of the things that really bothers me about this trying to litigate books these days. And politicians coming in and telling us what we should and shouldn't hear based on their own ideological or own religious or whatever. That's a very dangerous precedent in American letters right now. And readers need to help us fight that. And I don't know if I'm sure everybody on the panel here agrees, but let it be known that I'm sure Chris has this same process when she goes writing too. You have to authenticate the story, but you have to be aware of the political moment that you're in, and we're in one right now. So, can anybody? We've talked about newspapers.com, archives, that sort of stuff. Anybody have a favorite source that you've gone through, or a surprising source, or a place where you found information where you thought you'd never find it before? Any stories like that pop up?
Well, I'll hit a couple of things. First of all, for photographs, the Library of Congress
Oh, yes.
is absolutely fantastic, and it's fantastic for two reasons. They have great collections, and most of their material is free.
Is free.
It's all public domain, so it's a really tremendous resource. There are other great photo resources, certainly.
Right.
But Library of Congress, it's my first go-to on just about anything that I'm doing. And then the untapped resource, and it is really untapped, are local museums and local historical societies. And through them, you find the individual people that you need to talk to
Right.
to tell those stories. Because believe me, there's a lot of trunks and a lot of attics and a lot of houses
Right.
that have some really great stuff. And if people know what you're working on, they will sometimes give you that lead, that nugget to get you to where you are. One of my local histories, my encampment book, I was working on it. I live in a tiny town of 350, 400 people. And the town clerk knew I was working on this book. Everybody in town knew I was working on this book about encampment. And so, guy walked into the town hall and he said, I have this collection of photos, and they were taken by my grandfather. And his grandfather happened to be the editor of the Grand Encampment Herald during the mining boom. And he said, I want to give them to you. And she said, no, you don't. They either need to go to Candy Moulton or to the museum. And he contacted me, and she contacted me, and they got through to me, and I got those photos to use for my book, and they had never been published before. They were great panorama pictures of the town, and so he kept them all, the originals, but he allowed me to use everything. And then now subsequently we're getting those for the museum. So those kinds of things happen, especially in a small town. So if you're working on a story about a small town, I have an old friend who's no longer with us who always believed that the best information you could possibly get in a small town was go in a bar. And ask the guy sitting on the stool that's there every day, starting at least noon or whenever they open, and he's there all day and he knows everybody and everything. That's how you get information. I don't particularly do that, although I have heard some good story tips in bars back in the day when I was covering town council for the papers. And my attitude always was, I might hear it here. I will not report what I hear here in the bar, but I might call you tomorrow morning and ask you on the record. So.
Yeah.
I think I'm always amazed at the places where, the most unlikely places that you think you're going to find something. I wrote a book called Cowboys, Creatures, and Classics, The Story of Republic Pictures. Now, you would think that particular information would be at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science. It is not. It is at Brigham Young University.
Huh.
So I went there, and I loved being able to go through all that stuff at BYU. And I asked the 17-year-old kid who was handing me these things, why do you have all of the Republic Pictures stuff? And he said, I don't know, why do we have all the things that were on Hitler's desk? But they're here. And I said, wait a second. you have the things for, can you go and get those? What is that? A mug that says world's best boss? Go get those things. So, if you're ever wanting to write a book about, and I mean, a levity aside, if you're ever looking to write a book about that, who knew that that's where some of Hitler's things are at BYU?
When I was at Stanford, I discovered at Stanford they have Hitler's medical records. and he apparently had a nasal congestion and nasal infection that was affecting his brain. That was the hypothesis at the time. So, yeah. So.
That's a book right there.
I know. I know.
Get after it.
I know.
See, an ENT or this will happen.
Yeah.
Peter, do you have any?
I'll add a little one. This may sound obvious, but I found that the more sort of just friendly and honest and open that you go in when you're trying to meet somebody for the first time, it's amazing how that relationship then becomes where that person is now working way harder for you than you ever expected. So like I had a person like that who was an ace archivist at Dakota Wesleyan University. Her name is Lori Langland. And you know, it started with, hey, I have these files and I put bullet points and whatever, but then we talked. I ended up going down to meeting her after we met, the things that I got after the fact that she did over and above that I didn't really quite ask for, but little nuggets that ended up sort of working their way in. You know, this is what you need, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And at least I found that. And that was fantastic. And the more of those things that happen when you're just putting out there, you're saying, hey, I know you're super busy. I know I'm being a pain. If there's any way, if it's possible, however you put it, if you're your organic self, I feel like it comes back and you just get the good stuff.
A lot of times, I found in both of my books, family possesses things that they don't even know they have. And in my first book, which was about a New York Times correspondent who covered the Battle of Gettysburg and wrote what a lot of people think is the best battlefield dispatch ever written, sitting at his son's grave. His son had been killed the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so the book is about how he worked through all that and how he searched for him during the battle. And I got really, really lucky. I ran into a long ago, a distant relative who said, if you go to Buffalo and go to the Buffalo Historical Museum, they probably don't even know they have him. There are thousands of pages of correspondence between family members. And this goes back to authenticating the story. And I'm totally glad that it made my book, because if any of you have ever been to Gettysburg, go into the museum the next time you're there. I hope it's not there, but it's probably still there. There is an exhibit in there that tells the story of the two protagonists in my book. One of them was a 19-year-old artillery captain who was the youngest artillery officer in the Union Army. He was the son of the New York Times correspondent who was killed the first day. And the legend and the myth there is that he was holding the line on the first day, and his unit was being overrun, and he was shot through. His horse was shot through. The cannonball came through his horse and hit him in the right leg. And the legend is, and that's what they have up there, he fell off his horse, still directed his men. He had 6 guns on this knoll, and self-amputated his leg and put a tourniquet on it. And I went to by going to the original sources, which was the uncle writing a letter to the family about what actually happened to the boy, and I could only find one citation that cited this, and it was a citation of the best friend of the father, who I think wrote it to console his father. And but the point here is that out of this particular event, if you go to the New York Museum of Art right now, you can see a picture of this young man, 19 years old, holding a sword, holding the line, by a very famous Civil War illustrator who also was a friend of the father. And it depicts him as this mythical guy who lived this glorious death. And that's the way history recorded it. It's actually in Gettysburg, when in reality, other data or other letters that I found written describes him, including from a young woman who cared for him the last 10 hours of his life, when in reality he died a horrible death. He had tried to tourniquet his leg, but he bled out and was crying for his mother when he died. Now, that is not myth-making. That is reality. Yeah. But the myth that sits there in the New York Museum of Art is of this glorious young man holding his sword high. And on the second book, I got really lucky. Through crowdsourcing, I found the great-great-granddaughter who kept the papers, who really didn't know what to do with them, that her great-great-grandmother had written while she was blind at age 75 of her life. And so a lot of that is what I drew on from the book. And in her own words, they are a lot different than what was written about her. Another woman had taken her story in 1935, right after Little House on the Prairie came out, and I think wanted to emulate that, and wrote about this great family and how she came out here and did this work. Did not write anything about how she had been so poorly treated in the yellow press. The yellow press vilified them, divided them, and destroyed their marriage and all that sort of stuff. And then portrayed in the book as reconciling with her parents, when in fact after she married this native man, her mother never talked to her again. That's the true story.
Yeah.
So when you go down to that level of depth and there's, like I said earlier, I don't think there's really any excuse for not going down now. We have so much more available for it. I mean, Candy used the term, or I guess it was Peter used the term blog. That was written by this elderly gentleman. That word didn't even exist in the human language 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of material that's out there. It's a great age to be a researcher, but boy, do you have to be on your toes,
Well,
because
and
there's a
it-
lot that's repeated that's wrong.
And it's extremely hard because now you can find so much
Yeah.
that to try to sort through and
Exactly right.
synthesize it to the size of a
Overwhelming.
book you can actually write
Right.
is really difficult. That was the case with the
Yep.
book I did about the Mormon Handcart Company. The Mormon archival records are voluminous.
Yeah.
I mean, and you talk, sometimes you're just flat lucky. And when I got the contract on that, I have a super great friend, Will Bagley, who was really a great historian, probably the best one in my generation, I think. He was really great. And when he heard that I was going to do the Mormon Handcart book, he sent me 500 pages of original documentation research, all cited, everything, and said, here's a start for you.
Can you imagine the task that the archivists are having to do with the 500 million?
Yeah,
You know.
and that was my start. And then I dug for 5 years to get more.
Yeah.
And so it really is voluminous. And that is as challenging. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
not finding.
Can I just add something
Yeah,
on that?
yep,
So
absolutely.
like, just because I kept thinking like, wouldn't it be so awesome if I had an assistant? I did not have an assistant. You
Oh, yeah.
did not have an assistant for
No.
all those things we were speaking of. So that really
Yeah.
makes it quite in terms of like the 80-20 rule of where
Yeah.
you're going to put your time and what's going to be, more germane to staying on your narrative path versus kind of what has to be a little bit on the side or.
But then you think of all the side stories you've got to write in the rest of
Yeah,
your life,
right,
you know,
exactly.
which you never get to.
There was a question here.
I'm sorry, I got out of line. I thought, oh wait, maybe I'd wait till a question and answer. But is there a particular search engine or something that helps to weed out
Chris?
all the extra fluff or crap or junk or?
Search engines.
And maybe I'm not using the right terminology, but.
I don't know. I mean, I think we've already mentioned newspaper archives. That's always a good one. But
Yeah.
I mean, I use Ancestry.com,
Ancestry is
especially
really good.
when I'm trying to get to family members to give me the information that I need. Being able to track it from that particular standpoint. Not every family member is going to talk to you. I just finished doing the book on Machine Gun Kelly and his wife Catherine Thorne. Catherine Thorne's grandson is a real estate agent in New Jersey and shut me down in a quick hurry. But her cousins in Paradise, Texas said, come on down.
Mm.
So,
That's hilarious.
There's a question back here.
How do you approach a family member when you're wanting information from them, the initial introduction?
well, I think for example, I just finished a book on Bill Tillman too, the greatest lawman in Oklahoma. And his granddaughter lives in Scottsdale. And I called and spoke with her and, told her what I was looking to do. And she really wanted the story of her grandmother telling the story of Bill to be told. And so I think you just have to take cues when you're talking with them about that. Now that gentleman that I told you about in New Jersey was just, I don't want to talk about this. She was my grandmother and she was nice to me. And you're going to talk about her time when she kidnapped people, and I'm not talking to you about that. It's just,
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of being able to pick up on those cues, and what you're looking for. If you're looking to I know that she was a criminal, and I'm gonna talk about the criminal element, they're not gonna talk to you about that,
Yeah.
so.
Are there any other questions? One over here?
Well, I was wondering, I did research on a friendship quilt, and I was trying to find out who the people were and where this thing belonged. I bought it at a junk store, and I wanted to, it was too nice, I wanted to get it to a museum or something where it belonged. I got tons of information by researching on findagrave.com.
Yes,
Oh,
that's
yeah,
a
Find a
very
Grave.
good one, yep,
Yeah.
that's very good.
Right.
Because that's a original source, because a lot of families put
Yeah,
information in,
and
yeah.
sometimes, if you're lucky, there's some wonderful pictures.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really connected to Ancestry.com
Yeah.
too, so, yeah.
You can buy Ancestry.com and get newspapers.com too,
Yes.
in the subscription, so,
Of course, Find a Grave's free, but,
yeah.
and you can't go entirely by all their data. I mean, people go through and they take a picture of a tombstone
Yeah.
and presume that person's dead, and maybe they're not.
Well, that gets back to
But
authenticating.
there is a lot of,
Another thing to look forward to, especially, not forward to, but I mean, another thing to look at when you are doing some of this research, misspell a word.
Yeah.
Like, don't spell, if you're looking for something in Tucson, Arizona, don't spell it the way you think Tucson is spelled. Spell it up, and then you would believe how much stuff you get under
Yeah.
that misspelling.
Right, right. And some of the old Western spelling is different than, you know, it's particularly place names. You know, and they're changing a lot of place names now too, you know. I think last year the Department of, and so if you're looking for a particular location in 1880, last year I think the Department of Interior took away like 600 some squaw references in place names. So now they're totally different names. And so you have to go through that process of finding how they've been renamed at that point too. So, I mean, it just goes back to what we were talking about earlier. A politician once said, trust but verify. Or as you know, the old saying goes, Abraham Lincoln said, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." So, any other questions before we? I'm anxious to see if we're getting that chicken egg sized hail that they predicted on public radio this morning out here right now. But,
It's raining.
One problem I ran into, like history being
Yeah.
rewritten or whitewashed,
Right.
is it a matter of just like the newspaper archives to deep down how you, I mean, it took me a long time to find something that wasn't whitewashed on the one subject.
yeah, that's
Just
always a
keep
problem.
going.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing about the 1880s and 1890s, that was the period of the yellow press in this country, and a lot of it was sensationalist. You know, it was made up stuff or contrived stuff,
Kinda
or
like today.
well, I was going to say, you turn on cable TV tonight and you'll see the same thing. But you know, the point being that you know, you're right. I mean, you have to even there you have to go back and do the, you know, but a lot of those older newspapers also had eyewitness accounts or first person accounts. And that's about as authentic as you can get on that type of, you know.
Sometimes though, you gotta be really discerning with that, because
Right.
if you do anything like the gunfight at the OK Corral, there were a number of newspapers, and some were in favor of the Earps, some were in favor of the Clantons, so it depends on what you read,
Right.
so.
So try to
Exactly.
read every source.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And try to get 3 sources that it's that
Right,
verification.
exactly.
3 sources. Do you have
Right.
3 people? Even if their stories aren't exactly the same, you might get to the nugget of the truth.
And movies are the
read.
same way. I mean,
Yeah.
right, authenticate. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, like I have a friend who covered the war in Vietnam, and when Oliver Stone's movie came out about JFK's assassination, he was livid because he said there's going to be an entire generation of American, you know, young people growing up thinking that Tommy Lee Jones killed JFK, you know, because it was such a distorted view of history. And you know, and then you know when these movies start taking that kind of license, it really makes it harder. So, any other questions before we leave here?
Well, I just
Go ahead, right here.
going back to what you were saying and about how do you come to the point where you know you've got enough? Have you ever felt like I've just gone too far and I need to cut it off? I've got what I need. I mean, is that something you guys experience?
Chris?
I mean, because it seems like you could just
All
research
the time.
forever and never write anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time, but I mean, I think
It is
that's,
awesome.
I think it's a matter of you gotta try to get focused again.
Yeah.
What is the
That's
key of
what
what
you're
you're
saying,
doing? You know, I mean, if you're writing about Bill Tillman arresting Wiley Lynn in Cromwell, Oklahoma, and you come up on, hey, here's a great prostitution story, because you want to make sure that
Right.
you stay focused.
Discipline.
The word that I kept in my head, kept telling myself when I had these little nuggets, oh, maybe, I said, okay, narrative thread. What is it? Is this sort of a first cousin of that, or is this kind of like more of a nice to have, but really not keeping my foot on the accelerator in terms of the story?
So your
and
B of broaden also has to at some point really
Narrow.
be really
Right.
brought back into focus.
Exactly. But I think broadening in the beginning
Yeah.
helps you focus.
Yeah.
Because it gives you more of a complete view of it. I mean, it goes back to that confirmation bias. I'm gonna tell a story, well, you have to really challenge yourself sometimes along on that front too, so.
The best way to know when to quit researching and start writing is to look at your deadline. I mean, because you
that's
can
true.
continue to
Great point.
research forever.
That's very true, yes, that's very true.
Yeah.
The other thing is sometimes when you're doing research for books, you can find other books. My next book, I found researching my current book,
Absolutely.
so, yeah. There was a question back here?
You guys, this has been a great family. You really hit all the high points on research. But I was wondering, just personally, each of you, I imagine you all have an anecdote, but did you ever have a really good lead and everything was falling into place and then it's a dead end? It was destroyed,
Great
whatever,
question.
it's gone.
Great
Have you
question.
got just a quick personal story about that?
I'm trying. I'm thinking. It just turned out to be.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I have one, and it's a didn't get the last nugget I wanted, and it was my handcart book. The Mormon story, they ended up they were traveling through, and winter came. They got stranded in central Wyoming, and they left a lot of goods in central Wyoming, and the Mormons went on, and there was a rescue party that stayed behind. They made a list of what was in the wagons that they left behind. They made it. And we know that because there was a letter to Brigham Young. We made the list of everything that is here, and so we have a documentation of what was in those wagons. I dug, I tried, I wanted, I begged Will Bagley, I begged a couple of other researchers who really know the Mormon history archives. Can you find this I never found that document. Would have loved to have had that list, because then I would have known all the things that were in there that they might have been useful to staying warm, to feeding
Right.
themselves, to all kinds of things. That
It's probably in that trunk somewhere.
it's somewhere. I guarantee it's in the Mormon archives somewhere. I guarantee that list is there, because the list was sent to Brigham Young. So it is in the Mormon archives. That's just so
Yeah.
voluminous that probably who
Peter?
will find it.
I will probably think of one tonight, but I don't, right this second, I don't want to sort of, put something out there that's
right.
not truthful but hasn't been verified in 3 different ways.
Right.
I don't want to leave on that note.
Right.
Bad karma.
Right, well, I think, are there any other questions? Anybody else have any others? So, I'll leave it with this. Last week, the New York Times ran the old adage, have you ever heard the Harry Truman, if you need a friend in Washington, get a dog? Never said it. New York Times repeated it last week, has repeated it constantly. I've actually written to publications after they've said it. He never said it. Truth be known, Truman hated dogs. Was given a dog and gave it away and got in trouble back home in Missouri for doing it. Dog's name was Feller, and he had it for 5 weeks and he gave it away. So that if you next time you see that in a publication or in a newspaper or in a book, either write me or write the publisher. So because I'm on a crusade to get that one fixed. So, anyway, that's it. So,